yesterday, Judge Dredd.
Which one?
It's the first one with Sylvester Stallone in it. Yeah, easily probably top 5 worst movies I've ever seen in my life.
The remake's not much better.
Who does a remake?
You know the new Star Trek movies?
Yeah.
The guy that plays Bones is Dredd.
Oh, wait a minute. Maybe I don't know that. Yeah, but anyway, worst movie ever. All right, so Socratic method. Who remembers the Socratic method? I don't know, but I've got Chick-fil-A. The Socratic method, for the most part, was obviously the way Socrates, hence Socratic method, would dialogue with people, right? He didn't have a very particular or nuanced philosophy himself, right? He wasn't necessarily trying to defend one particular philosophy per se, more than he was really just questioning and critiquing constantly what everybody thought, right? That was why he's called the horsefly of Athens or gadfly of Athens. He just aggravated people because it's questioning, right? So the Socratic method is a way of dialogue. In fact, it's very famous for, naturally, a lot of philosophers teach that way. They teach via the Socratic method, meaning that it's more of a Q&A type interaction with the end goal of steering a conversation a certain way, but by doing it with questions, right? Does that make sense? And there's a lot of benefit to that. You know, one, it just comes across less confrontational. It helps people think through their own answers and all that kind of thing. Just a lot of benefit to it. But at the same time, it can be manipulated and used in a wrong sense, because you can steer the conversation in certain directions, which, and again, depending on whose hands or whose mouth it's in, can be used in a manipulative type manner. Does that make sense? So it's a powerful tool that can be used kind of either way. It can be used for the good or the bad kind of thing, like fire or guns or whatever else. Kind of talk about that, and I can give you kind of a boiled down version that you can use to talk to people, especially people that are being difficult. You know, when you're trying to have some sort of rational conversation with people, the Socratic method is very beneficial there. Or, so this is your choice. We can talk about that, or we can debate. Say I can go through some sort of argument for a cultural hot button topic, like why abortion's wrong or something, or why it's right, whatever. So it's up to you. Do you want to do something like the Socratic method, or would you rather hear, say, an argument on a cultural hot button topic?
I just want to be real mad.
Well, you don't have to even be in here for that. You just go watch, flip on a couple news outlets.
Socratic method, just so like
I mean,
little
about
philosophy
Castro,
satchel.
Yeah.
But then part of me wants to argue. So.
Right. All right. Well, we'll do it. We'll do it the democratic way. I'll be like Fidel Castro, and we'll have a vote, and everyone can do what you would like. I know. No, you forgot, Piper. All right. So honestly, we'll vote. Which one do you want to do? Who wants to do kind of learn kind of a nuts and bolts version of the Socratic method, or who wants to hearsay an argument for huh?
And then everyone raises their hand.
Yeah, so we need to stop there, right? First, raise your hand if you want to hear a Socratic, kind of a essential nuts and bolts version of the Socratic method to use that. Nobody wants to do that? That's awesome. I honestly, I really like that. All right, so who wants to do you hear an argument for a position on a cultural hot button topic, say like abortion or something?
Yeah, probably one of those.
Raise your hand for that one.
Yeah.
All right, so everybody wants to hear that. All right, well, I guess we'll do that if that's what you want. Remember, you asked for this. What movie was that? Oh, no. So you just gave an unwarranted response. Like, you said that, and I was like, oh, well, she knows what movies that's from. And then, like, there's no reason. Like, there's no reason for you saying it. All right, so let me pull this up, you fiends. What cartoon character would sing this all the time? Angel in the skies. Bugs Bunny.
Or like somebody from Bambi.
Bambi?
Like the bird from Bambi.
Hey, Piper, lay off the F-bombs during recordings.
Forever though. Like, I haven't.
It's been forever. What, since your F-bomb or since recorded? Or both?
The first one is I'm talking
All right, so where is it?
Yeah, like a little desert.
Or an air horn.
I'll just send them like the buzzer.
Beep, ma, beep, burr. Beep, beep, burr. Where is this?
Any like expletive is used in like decreases in.
Where is this, for Pete's sake?
I didn't even notice you said it. Like
It's just Piper.
it's like I hear it so much. It's like whatever. Oh, you did all of it.
Or just a good adjective.
Oh no, he said the if word. It's just a good adjective. No, it works in South Park. It's the most versatile word in English.
You can use it.
It's very versatile.
That's so true. Oh my gosh.
Like it's so widely used during World War I and II that if you didn't use it.
You see, that's what's crazy. It's like my granddad, you know, some of yours probably you probably may kind of overlap that generation. But like my granddad, so like everybody my age, our grandparents, you know, everybody was in World War II. Like, I mean, it's just,
Felt like it is.
well, so one of the things I got so upset about was like, you know, that show Band of Brothers, you know, which is kind of the same thing, and Private Ryan and all that stuff. Well, one of the things they got upset about, like, they were like, nobody taught like this then. They were like, of course, every once in a while you would hear that, so it wasn't unheard. But you know how like in our culture, it's just basically everyday language. Like you pull up to Chick-fil-A, hey, I'd like a motherfucking Coke and a. And so like I remember him watching that. He was so upset. He was like, people didn't. He was like, you just didn't talk like that in everyday conversation. It just wasn't that way. You know, basically kind of an anachronism that you put our culture as a template back on an older culture or a different culture. Does that make sense? So again, he's like, no, I mean, people would say that, but it wasn't like every 5 words. Like I remember he got so mad about that when he'd watch those movies. Like, people shouldn't do this. Like, he's like, you make us look like you. You guys are the turds, is what he would say. Like, we didn't do that. All right, so anyway, here we go. Let me get this thing going. My granddad and all of his brothers were drafted, every one of them. It really was like the Private Ryan thing. Everyone, he had 4 brothers, all of them are gone. All right, so here we go. You guys missed the vote. We did a thing. We want to do Socratic method or hear a cultural hot button topic. All right, so we'll ramrod through this. So, all right, we'll argue, since right now it's on the opposite side of the law to hold the pro-life stance, we'll argue that, right? We'll do the opposite side of what's considered to be right and moral and legal. All right, so here's your argument. Here it starts in the syllogism, right?
Yeah, that.
All right, so here's your syllogism. What's the syllogism? What is a syllogism?
It's a statement where
It's a formalized argument, right? All right, so here it is. First premise. What do you think the first premise is going to be of this argument?
if X.
Well, that could be a hypothetical. We're doing a deductive syllogism, right? This is a deductive syllogism. Remember, if the premises are true, what happens to the conclusion of the deductive syllogism?
Let's also.
It has to be, right? Whether you like it or not. So the way you got to get around it is what? Show that what? It's false. You got to show that one of the premises is false, right? Unless you commit an informal fallacy or commit a formal fallacy, right? One of the rules of logic is broke, right? All right, so this would be the first. It is wrong, immoral, whatever. We'll just say wrong. It's wrong, immoral to what?
Kill,
Kill what?
innocent person.
Right, kill innocent folks, right? It's wrong, immoral to, we'll just say take innocent life. Innocent human life. So far, uncontroversial, right? So next premise would be what? Abortion, what?
Takes an innocent life.
Right. Takes, kills, terminates innocent human life. Therefore, your conclusion, abortion is immoral or wrong, right? All right, so if that's our syllogism, and remember, if it's valid, if it's logically valid, meaning, nobody's broken the undistributed, there's not an undistributed middle term, you don't have an illicit minor term, you don't have an illicit major term, you don't have a four-term fallacy, any of the formal rules. If all those are right, and there's no informal fallacy, then does the conclusion follow, whether you like it or not? Yes. So if you don't like this conclusion, if you think this conclusion is wrong, what do you have to do? What do you have to do?
Prove one of those points wrong.
Right. So where do you think the contention is going to be? Do you think the contention is going to be it's wrong or immoral to kill an innocent human person?
Do the second one.
Right. Right. So where's our little magic marker? Eraser. Here it be. All right. So this is not going to be contested, that it's not wrong, right? It's not going to be contested that it's wrong to take an innocent human person's life or whatever, right? So what we're going to have to do, I'm going to have to show you where the argument's gone. This used to be the argument. It's immoral to kill an innocent human being. All right, so for a while before our understanding in embryology and scientific this, that, and the other came along in regards to the biological person, it was thought to be that you could argue that this was what? Aha, what?
That fetus isn't a human being.
It's not a human being, right? Now, the problem with that is that scientifically speaking, it's not inhuman, right? Meaning that it's human in some sense, right? It's not, for instance, it's a being of some sort. So is it a tomato being? Is it a rutabaga being? Is it a tadpole? Is it a fish? Is it whatever? It's a human being of some sort. So the argument has changed from that because virtually both sides, either side concedes that it's a human being. So this is now the new argument. Human person. What do you think is the difference between a human being and a human person?
Be like anything. That would be like a fertilized egg. Like I feel
Well,
like
technically
anything-
speaking, there's no such thing as a fertilized egg, right? Because
Oh,
it
yeah.
ceases to
What is it
be,
called again? After-
that's just conception. It's a, zygote?
like the number one, that would be like a human being, but a person, like, I feel like that would be something with like a brain and a heart.
Right, they said there's a difference between a human being and a human person, right?
Yeah.
All right, so that's where the argument has a change. Now the argument you see changed what? To a philosophical position, right? Because the first is a scientific position. meaning that there's no difference, scientifically speaking, between a human being and a human person. So the argument changed to what? Is philosophy important? You better believe it's important, because right here, it's if philosophy is right or wrong, it says who or what can live. If philosophy is not important, then it's really odd, because right now philosophy is about to try to tell you whether or not you are a human person or not a human person. That's kind of scary, right? So philosophy matters, right? Here's an instance where philosophy really, the rubber hits the road, so to speak, right? Because again, why? Because it's about to say if you're a human person or not. Because if you're not a human person, but you're a human being, then apparently it's okay to what? Kill you, right? So here's where the argument has switched: is human being or human person. All right, so what do you think one of the first objections to, say, the pro-life stance would be? What's one of the first objections to that? Go ahead.
Like if the mom's life is in danger, or I don't know, like it's necessary if the mom's life is in danger. And there are like situations where like the kid is not viable outside of, you know what I mean? It's not viable outside of the womb. So it's kind of like.
Right, sometimes like what's called an ectopic pregnancy, right?
Yeah.
Something like that. Even though there have been kids that have lived through that somehow. I mean, but anyway, let's go to a better objection, because let's say, for sake of argument, that people will concede, okay, if the mom's life is in danger, then all right, that's applicable, right? So let's say that everybody concedes that. But that's not the argument, because again, if everybody would concede that, nobody would still say, all right, so now therefore abortion shouldn't be the law of the land, right? They would still say, no, it still should be. Well, wait a minute, I thought if we all conceded that if the mom's life was in danger, okay, we'll concede that. So now can we get rid of it? No. All right, so that can't be the objection, right? So what do you think another objection might be?
Well, those are the two base ones,
Okay.
but the real reasons are only just convenience.
All right, so we'll put those up, right? Or what did you say the second one was?
Like, she can't afford to have a child.
All right, can't afford it. We'll put financial.
Birth control is free.
What's that?
I said, but birth control is free.
Well, let's say it was an accident or something. Like it was a
Ain't
hard
no
way.
such thing.
Well, I mean, they're technically. All right, so what might be another objection?
Oh yeah, the woman's choice, which I think is like the weakest argument.
Like,
It's her choice.
Okay,
whether
woman's
she wants
body.
to have a kid or not. Like,
Woman's body. Yours was just choice, right? You have the right to choose, right?
Yeah.
All right, what's another argument, or what's another objection? What about it's part of the woman's body, right? Or did we just say that? Yeah, part of the woman. We said that, right? Part of the woman's body. What about come on, guys, you hear this stuff every day.
well, there's one thing like a eugenics type or whatever argument where they were trying to keep people of certain races from being born. That was
Or maybe-
fairly in the.
Yeah.
That's not something that people would throw out now, but they like literally the people who started Planned Parenthood, they were like, we're trying to eliminate the black race, stuff like that. Crazy stuff.
Yeah, Margaret saying.
Family humiliation.
Yeah, we'll say that. Humiliation, embarrassment, shame. We'll say shame. What about something like men don't even say, let's say right now, because I'm a guy, I don't have any business even talking about this issue because I'm not a woman. How about that? So we'll say men don't have a right to speak on it at all.
Okay, arguments.
So I'll just put that to that. Now, what about, and of course we can charge these emotionally, right? Like we can go into depth about this, say a story like this, right? So we don't want to minimize this kind of stuff, right? And you don't want to minimize any of these because is it, let me ask it this way. Should you minimize something like this? No, absolutely not, right? Because remember, if we've gone through our ethical theory, so if you haven't found out by now, after having gone through our ethical theories, that I don't believe in relative morality, right? I think there really are true rights and wrongs. So this right here, say rape, if I saw someone doing that to someone, I'm going to tell you, if it's within my capabilities, I'm putting my boot in the back of your neck about 600,000 times until you probably don't see anything else forever, right? So we don't want to minimize this kind of crap, right? At all. At the same time, because we're trying to look at this logically or philosophically, we're going to try and, hard as it may be, to divorce ourselves from the emotional aspect, right? Because we want to try to think about it reasonably or objectively, if we can, right? Logically speaking. Without minimizing that, without any of these emotional aspects, we don't want to minimize those emotional aspects, but we want to at least try to step back and look at it reasonably or logically, just like we would any argument, right? We want to try to not think with our emotions, but think with our intellect, right? Or reason with quote unquote impassionately, if possible. Now, let's look at this. Let's look at this one first. It's part of the woman's body. Well, again, this is just difficult scientifically because, or here's another one. It's just a clump of cells. Let's put that one there. The difficulty with the first one we're about to say, the woman's body, is that there are a couple odd questions that could be asked that the pro-life advocate would say really show that may not necessarily be a good objection at all. What do you think they might say to that, the woman's body objection?
They would say if the child is its own body, the child doesn't have to say in this. Like it's the woman's body and the child's body.
Right. So what would the pro-life advocate say to that type of objection, that it's the woman's body? Say I'm a woman and I say, look, man, like it's my body. Like I can do with my body what I want to do with my body.
The child isn't your body.
Well, you're assuming it's a child. You're just assuming that. Right? All right, so here's the difficulty with that. We know, again, from the moment of conception. Who's seen that little thing where or lately, I think this was back in the summer, where they show when they filmed the moment of conception. Have y'all seen that? Where this light, it makes an explosion of light. Have y'all seen that? Have you seen it? You did? That was nuts, man.
That's literally the film.
Yeah, yeah. Like,
oh.
Well, and we knew that it did that in other animal species, but it had never been seen in humans before. And when at the moment of conception, there's just literally this poof, ball of light that exploded. It's crazy. Anyway, we know. So what got me on that was talking about from the moment of conception. So from the moment of conception, we know that genetically speaking, there's literally nothing different than, say, Piper, if Piper lives to be 95 years old. Genetically speaking, there will be nothing different from Piper from the very moment of his conception until his death at 95. Meaning that at the moment of conception, his sex is determined, his hair color is determined, his eyes are determined. Everything about him is set from the very moment that he's conceived. There's no period in there where he's still not male or female, or he's still not this or that. Like, genetically speaking, he's set from the very moment. There's nothing different from him from the very moment of his conception until he's 95. Now, that in itself starts to lean heavily that it may not necessarily be just the woman's body or immediately. Another difficulty is that from the moment of conception, obviously, Piper or whoever would immediately have his own DNA or genetic code, meaning that, say if I were walking in this room, there was a crime and we took a DNA sample and we traced it back to you, it would come back to who? you, right? You know, if it was your DNA, it would come back to you, right? You are the perpetrator of that particular crime or whatever. Now, let's say in theory, somehow the fetus or whatever in the womb committed a crime and left its DNA mark. Well, if the DNA was investigated, the DNA would not trace back to the mother. It would trace back to who? The being in the womb, right? Because it has its own, it's completely genetically distinct from its mother, right? Again, meaning if it committed the crime, even from the moment of conception, the DNA would not match the mother's, it would go to that. So it would be odd to say that it's the mother's body if the DNA fingerprint, as it were, doesn't even match the mother's. Now, we also know that the fetus, again, has its own genetic code, has its own DNA fingerprint, has its own blood type, now which may or may not match, you know, the mother, just depending on chance or whatever. If it has its own genetic code, its own DNA fingerprint, its own blood type, its own nervous system, its own brain function, its own, and then kind of humorously, gender, you know, it's either male or female. So ethicist at Baylor, he likes to say this, well, not joke, but he asked very bluntly, because its gender or sex is determined and already there. And if the woman says it's part of her body, ethicist, like I said, philosopher at Baylor, Frank Beckwith says, well, can I be blunt with you? Yes. You know, he would say to the pro-choice advocate, he would say, ma'am, do you have a penis? And she's like, you know, of course, doesn't like that. And he said, well, because if you do, well then, or if the baby's if that's your body and that's a baby boy or a fetus, if the fetus is male, then you have a penis because it does, right? Or vice versa, right? So the point being that, right, then you have two other things, right?
No, I mean, like a guy.
Right, right. Like the boy in the womb could technically be said to have, you know, the other thing, right? But he says, but clearly that's absurd. You know, if you've got all of this information that lines up on DNA fingerprint, on genetic code, on blood type, on central nervous system, on function, on gender, then what does it mean in any sort of relevant sense to say that it's your body? When clearly it's not your body, it's a different body. So you'd have to change it to it's dependent upon. So this is where that argument's changed. It's dependent upon what? What? The mother's body, right? Now it's dependent upon that. So again, because scientifically it can't be this, because it's just shown that it can't be that, right? It's distinct from that. So it has to be, oh, well, it's dependent upon the body, right? Which is a different argument, right? Now let's skip that one for a while. What might be another, which also too, all the stuff that we just listed, that would also show why this argument doesn't necessarily really work, right? It's not just that, right? It's human, and it's a distinct human, so it can't just be possibly that. But there's a philosophical difficulty with this too. What do you think the philosophical difficulty with this is? That kind of covers maybe the scientific aspect of it. What do you think the philosophical difference is in that? The philosophical relevant difference in that is? If that was an objection, it's a clump of cells. Well, the scientific aspect, well, if you go through all that, it's not just a clump of cells. It's a lot more complicated than, you know, it's not a wart, which, by the way, nobody cares if you get rid of. Who cares? If it is just something like that, if it is just a clump of cells, well, then who cares, right? Nobody cares. But what's the philosophical difference or difficulty with that objection, clump of cells? What are you? You're a clump of cells, just more of them. So that would be the philosophical difficulty, is that, well, what does that matter if you and I are both the same thing, just a different number of clumps of cells combined, right? So that seems to have a couple difficulties. First, just the one with the scientific thing, the whole argument that distinguishes the body from the mothers, but then also too, the clump of cells, which again, it speaks to that, but it also would be a philosophical oddity to say that because you just are that, right? Now, just again, more of them. But again, the exact same template, right? Same genetic code, same gender, same sex or whatever, same nervous system, all those things in place, right? Immediately. You're that. That's what you are. You just multiplied, right? To a larger degree. Now, since the argument has moved from human being to human person, and the pro-life advocate wants to say that the being in the womb really is a human person, what would the argument shift to at that point?
I've heard people say that.
Yeah, give any argument you hear.
I've heard people say that the mother's life is more important because she's already an adult. She's, you know what I mean? She can make choices. Like her life has more value than the fetus.
Does it?
Well, and that would be
I'm
it.
just saying that's
That would be
what I've
something
heard.
like, that would be related to something like functionalism, right? That your functions determine your worth. Now, again, the difficulty with that would be that same argument. What were some of the reasons? She can make choices, right?
Yeah.
She has a future of some sort in regards to maybe a career or whatever. She has, fill in the blank. But the difficulty with that is that same argument would apply against who? Huh?
In favor of the child.
Well, it would, that argument could be applied to what? It's just as easily.
And like special needs people would be like, oh, let's get rid of them. Like
Not only them, but the baby you just looked at, right, in the
Yeah.
picture. The infant.
yeah.
Because the infant makes no choices. It can't function in any shape, form, or fashion in the relevant sense that's talking about choices and all those sorts of things, which is why Peter Singer, ethicist is it Yale or Harvard, argues that every child up to 1 year of age should be allowed to be aborted, like that baby you saw.
Was
Because he embraces the logic. He's an ethicist. He's one of America's most leading ethicists right now. Dead serious. That you should be allowed to kill children up to 1 year old. Because that's the logical consequence, right? If functionalism is your argument, and so he thinks that's right. And he says, yeah, that's right. 1 year old. He argues for that position.
He argues for that.
Yeah, and again, that's people don't want to accept that, but logically speaking, that's the accepted position if you're going to hold to those arguments. But that shows the inconsistency of most people. They see that and they balk. Why? Why do they balk?
Because they know it's.
I think it's probably, again, I think it's intuitively obvious that if you went up and got that kid, stomped it, that you're probably wrong for doing so. It's probably not right to do that. Now, here's the philosophical argument, where since the human being argument essentially has been done since we've discovered more about embryology and scientific studies in regards to the human person, all that kind of thing. Since it swapped over to the human person argument, this is what pro-life philosopher, somebody like Scott Klusendorf, and then he's used the template of a guy named something, Alvin or Alan Shore, something like that. Anyway, their point is this, philosophically. They say there's no difference between a human being and a human person except these things. There's no human, they would say philosophically, there's no difference between a human being and a human person except this: your size, your level of development, your environment, and your degree of dependency. They would say there's no difference between a human being and a human person except those things. Now, what do you think they mean by that? So let's go back to some of your arguments, some of the objections. And let's say the pro-life advocate says, you have a human person in your womb. The fetus is a human person. And it's wrong. And again, if the syllogism is right, it's wrong to intentionally take the life of an innocent human person, the life of an innocent human person. Therefore, abortion is immoral or wrong or whatever. And so they say, you being pregnant have a human person. That's a human person, and it's wrong to take their life. Now, any argument they say that you can give against that being a human person, this is what those guys say, Klusendorf, Schwartz, this is what they're going to say. They're going to say any argument that you give that that's not a human person is going to fall logically into one of these categories. So let's try that. What might an argument be? And then they say there's an easy way to see this. We'll get to that in a second. That's what they're going to use to help you see it. So what argument might you throw out? Let's role play. All right, that's a human person. There's a human person and you're pregnant. That's a human person. You can't terminate him or her. What were some of our objections a minute ago? I can't afford it, right? I can't afford it right now. I've got to go to school. Could you off him if you can't afford it? Why? Why can't you take his life if you can't afford it? Right, that would be the definition of it, but why can't you do that to him or her? Why can't you? Right, so what does that assume? So what does the objection assume? That the one in the womb is not a human person, right? So the question is that a person? Because the objection, oh, but you can't afford it. That assumes, you're assuming that's not a person. But that's the argument, right? Because you wouldn't do it here. But you wouldn't do it here. Why? Because you see that this is a human person, right? All right, so let's go again. We're not diminishing any of the emotional aspect of it, but say the rape. Let's say that this little girl is a product of that. Can you kill her? Why? She's the product of rape. Why can't you? Because she's a human person, right? Now, again, does that diminish that other aspect? No, not at all, right? If we're trying to look at it philosophically or logically, that may not be a good reason to say that you can dismiss her, right? Because you can't do it here. But if you can't do it here, you're saying that you can't do that because it's a human person, but you're assuming that this isn't a human person, right? But that's the argument. Go ahead.
So are you using that you're
Not yet. Right now, we're just showing how this reveals the true, what you're assuming over here about the being in the womb, right? This is just showing what you're assuming about the being in the womb, right? So what if you were to say, what if your career, well, my career, I don't have time for my career to have a child right now, so blah, blah. Would you terminate this little boy or little girl for the sake of your career? Why? It's a human person, right? So you're assuming that this is not what? A human person, right? So the question always boils back to, what is this? This being in the womb, B-I-W. The question is what? At the end of the day, it should boil down to what? What is the being in the womb? Is it a human person? Right? Because if it's a human person, For the same reason that you can't, none of those objections would come close to allowing you to terminate this person. If this is a person, then they shouldn't be able to affect this one either. Does that make sense? And so all of those objections assume what? That the being in the womb is not a human person, right? All right, so now arguments come in these. Well, all right, it can't possibly be a human. That can't be a human person because it is this freaking big, right? Even smaller than that at a time, right? In a week or two, it'll be this big, 12 weeks about this big, which is about when the average abortion occurs, about that big. It can't be a human, it's this big. It can't be a human person, it's this big. What those guys, Klusendorf and Schwartz, those guys are going to argue what? Philosophically what? The only difference between a human person and a human being, you're saying, is size. So they're saying by that, and then they would employ a reductio ad absurdum. They would say, all right, since Piper's bigger than Marina back there, he has more value than she does because he's a bigger human person than she is, right? Well, no, they would say. They would say, how can size determine your worth? How does size determine moral worth? Or they might say, for instance, do a thought experiment, the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids movie. You remember those? The original one? Not the crappy ones after that. Well, even that one was kind of crappy, but the original one. Would it be any more permissible to stomp them into the dirt or whatever because they got shrunk than it would be if they were at their normal size? Why? Because it seems like they would say philosophically, there's no moral difference in the size of a human person, right? Bigger or larger doesn't give you any more moral weight. Of the universe itself, when we blow out and expand the universe and look at, we're specks, right? Right? Or again, does Shaquille O'Neal, 7 foot something, have more moral worth than, say, a midget or whoever? That doesn't seem to be relevant in the moral, in the ethical sense of the word, right? He doesn't seem to have any more moral value or worth because he's bigger or larger than that one does, right? The small person. All right, so what about all right, it doesn't even look human. Look, imagine before you see at the 11 or 12 week mark. Look at that. You can't tell me that is a human person. Look at it. It does not even look like a human person.
So you're saying that somebody else in an accident has become no longer a human person because they look different?
Right, you might say something like that. You might, like the movie The Elephant Man, remember? They wanted to kill him, and he's like, I'm a human. Like, I look like this, but I'm still human. But that would still, but you might argue, but that's a freak of nature, right? That's an anomaly. And I don't mean freak of nature in a pejorative sense. I mean, like, that normally doesn't happen. You were in a car wreck or the Elephant Man, that's not normal. That's not a quote unquote normal thing. So they would say it like this. They would say, all right, well, if it doesn't look like a quote unquote human person, you're just doing this. What? You're appealing to what? Its level of development. Because they would say, well, if you're a human person, apparently every human person has looked like that at that stage in their development. Just like every toddler looks like a toddler at that stage of their development, right? That's what a human at that stage of its development looks like if you're 2 years old. If you're 90 years old, that's what a human looks like at that stage of its development, right? If you're 15 years old, that's what a human person looks like at that stage of its development. If you're a fetus, they would say, that's what a human looks like at that stage of its development. You're confusing what it looks like. You're confusing a level of its development with what? It being a human person. When every human person looks different at different stages of their development. Does that make sense? That's what they would say. All right, so what about, well, look, it's not even outside of the womb. How can it possibly be a human person if it's not even outside the womb? How can it possibly be a human person if it's not outside the womb? We're just going down the list. What would they say to that?
Why is being inside or outside the womb?
Well, they're saying what? So your environment determines whether or not you're human or non-human person. You're a non-human or a human person. So for instance, the other day, did you see, they would say this argument, and I even saw this just the other day, where the baby, now they can do surgery in utero, and they removed the baby, opened up the mother, had surgery, literally performed surgery on the baby. And so it went, all of a sudden it was a human person because it's out of the, and then it goes back and now it's not a human person anymore. And so now it can be aborted. But outside the womb, if they had got a hammer and smashed it, it would have been murder. Back in there, close her back up. Now you can perform the procedure and it wouldn't be.
Yeah, they see the.
So they would say, let me say this and then you say that. So they would say, why does a 6-inch journey down a birth canal transfer you from non-human person to human person? They'd say, what's magical about that? Why is that the magical moment of you being a non-human person or a human person? A birth canal. Or they would say, all right, so let's say you have identical twins. Let's say one twin is born, they're the same age. Let's say they even split, they're identical, right? Same genetic information for the most part, of course, slight differences. Everything, so long story short, they're the same, right? Let's say one is born 30 seconds before the other. Why is this one a human person and this one's not a human person? Or what if they would have been reversed? What if the other would have been born first and the other's still not born 30 seconds later? But so now that one's a human person before this one's a human person. When the only thing was different was the place in which they were.
If you think of that, it's so, it really is absurd though, because that'd be like the doctor delivering the baby like, oh, now you're human.
Right, now you're a human person.
Yeah. I just
Like
feel like that's-
halfway.
Yeah.
Or think about this.
Yeah.
Or think about this. Think about a premature child. Let's say that you have two women that become pregnant at the same time, which happens, I'm sure, all the time. Let's say that one baby is born prematurely, a solid 10 weeks before the other child. Prematurely comes out the size of your hand, it's they have it in the NICU, all that stuff. Same age. You can't harm that child. It's a human person now because it was born prematurely. But you could go to the other one and terminate that one because it's not a human person. Yet they're the same age, the same size. They're just one's on this side of the skin, one's on this side of the skin. So how did that determine? And let's say those were reversed. Say that's the human person and this one's not because it's still on that side of the womb. But let's say it's reversed. That one was born prematurely, this one wasn't. So now this one is the human person and this one's not the human person, even though nothing's changed. Except what? Their environment. Nothing's changed about them except their environment. So Klusendorf and Schwartz, they would say something like, all right, so if you roll over on this side of the bed, does that make you more valuable than if you had rolled over on that side of the bed? Or if you or if you're on this side of the street and you cross over to that side of the street, are you more valuable as in regards to moral worth than if you would have just stayed on that side of the street?
Yeah, we'd be like saying.
Their point is just what does your environment have to do with your moral worth? What's the moral significance of your environment? Does that make sense? That's their question. And so they'd say, if that's your objection to there not being a human person, then you're just confusing where they are for their ontological status as human persons. That's what they would say, right? So what if you said, all right, well, look, kind of going back to the degree of dependency thing, when we said it's not the mother's body, it's dependent on the mother's body. How can it be a human person if it's 100% dependent upon its mother for survival? How can that possibly be a human person if it's completely dependent on something else, namely its mom for its survival? How could that be a human person?
Well, someone on life support isn't.
Well, there you go. That's one of the arguments. They're saying, so people that are on life support or that are on dialysis machines for kidneys or whatever, however that works, those people aren't human persons when they're on those machines, but then they're human persons when they're not, when they're off those machines. Or again, what argument could that equally apply to? Special needs people, but also who else? A perfectly, quote unquote, what we would see as normal, what? Infant. Or when you're an infant, right? An infant is 100% dependent upon its mother for its survival, right? Even if it's breastfeeding or whatever the case may be. So is it not a human person because it's completely dependent upon somebody or something else for its existence?
Diabetic, I might as well not be.
Well, yeah, there you go.
Can't.
If degree of dependency is the argument that separates a human person from a human being. Again, which is why Peter Singer, ethicist, one of America's top-rated ethicists, again would say, yeah, right, up to a year old, you can kill.
Does he believe that, or is he doing that?
No, he believes it because he believes those philosophical assumptions, right?
People agree with him, right?
Yeah.
If you just have kids, I'm like, just shut up, but someone.
Some do. Some have kids and still argue that. All right, so that's the nuts and bolts of their argument is this. The first question should always be, what is what? The being in the womb, right? Why do they say that should always be the question? Because what about the other factors? Are they relevant? In one sense, they're relevant, right? But in another sense, they're not relevant if they wouldn't allow you to what? If they wouldn't allow you to terminate this little girl or little boy, then they shouldn't be relevant here. Because they're saying this shows you, if you won't let that work here, then you wouldn't let it, then what you're assuming is this person is not, that this being in the womb is not a human person, right? So they're saying the question should always be asked, what is the being in the womb? Is it a human person? If it's a human person, then those external factors that you're arguing for aren't sufficient, right? So then they say, all right, so if your argument is that it's not a human person, anything that you're going to give, scientifically speaking, that's already waxed out, right? That's any embryology, basic embryology textbook will say that life begins at conception. Any embryology textbook will say that. There's no question as to when does life begin, right? I mean, a living sperm unites with a living egg to form a new cellular being of some sort that immediately is reproducing cell. It's alive, right? There's no argument as to when it's alive. There's no non-life involved in the process, right? So the question is the human being a human person? And then so their argument is there's no difference between a human being and a human person that is not what they would say arbitrary, right? They would say if you try to distinguish a human being from a human person, then you're being radically arbitrary. Now, what about this objection? What about the objection when they say, well, look, it's completely like it's biological systems aren't even completely formed yet. How can that be a human person when there's some major components of its biological system that aren't fully formed? What would these guys say? Remember, based off just their differences here. What do you think that would fall under? This one, right? Would it be this one? Their biological systems aren't fully formed? Would it be this one right here? Degree of what? Level of development, right? And so they might say something like this. What's a good example? All right, let's say my girls, my 5-year-old and my 7-year-old. Their sexual reproductive systems aren't fully formed at all. They won't be until they're years from now, right? But are they any less persons because their biological systems aren't fully formed yet? In fact, most of you guys aren't even to your level of maturity as in regards to the latest study showed that you don't even really begin to reach your full level of thinking capacity until about your mid-20s or so. Then you really do start to, that has quote unquote fully formed in that sense. So are you any less of a person now because there are parts of you and parts of your system or functions or whatever that aren't fully formed yet? Well, no, right? It would seem like the answer would be no. You're not any less of a person because you haven't reached that stage of development yet, right? Meaning that your level of development is not inhibiting you from being a person. You're still a person, is what they would say, right? Quickly, one of the things that they would like to point out is that anytime, historically speaking, that there has been a separation of a human being from a human person, they would argue what? Disastrous results. When has this happened in history? When we've tried to make distinctions between human beings and human persons. Like when, though, specifically?
I don't know, Nazi Germany.
Right.
They were like doing
Right. They were human beings, but they weren't really what? They weren't truly human persons. In fact, the slogan was what? Life unworthy of life. That was their slogan, right? Life unworthy of life.
They could go back to slavery too, though.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
What was the Dred Scott decision? 3/4 what? Blacks counted as 3/4 of a full person.
And but they still couldn't vote. Yeah.
Well, right. Well, that's the same. Anything, but were they human beings? Yeah. But they couldn't count fully as human persons. So the pro-life advocate would always want to point out anytime there's been a distinction between a human being and a human person, there's been disastrous results, right? Now, does that prove their argument? Not necessarily, right? Doesn't prove it, right? But they would still want to say what about that point? What? They would probably say it's a red flag, right? Hey, look, wait a minute. Look what, anytime we've tried to make this distinguish between human being and human person, look what's happened. And then they might go into something like that, right? Like these types of arguments or whatnot. Now, what is another objection to that argument? To this argument up here, this pro-life position argument? First off, let's remind ourselves, why are we arguing this thing? Cultural hot button topic, right? And two, this is, theoretically speaking, the minority position, right? Because this is not the law. The law of the land is against this, right? Right? Yes. Right now, the law is against this model. So, if you're going to hold to something like that view, you're going to be against the law of the land, right? And if 53% or whatever the statistics are now, I forget, of Americans think that that's okay, then you're also going to be in the minority position, right? So if you're going to hold a minority view, you'd at least better have what? Some sort of reason to hold it,
Yeah.
right? Because if your view is already in the minority, then you'd better start to question your view, because maybe there's a good reason that your view is in the minority. Maybe there's a good reason that the majority disagree with you. But truth is also not determined by what? Right. It's not determined by nose counting, right? It's not determined by hand raising, right? That's not how truth is gotten at. But it may be a red flag against a position if everybody, for instance, everybody believes in here right now, for the most part, everybody believes that you're in this room right now, right? So if you're the one guy that doesn't believe you're in the room right now, that might be a red flag to say that your position's wrong, right? But it may not be. So if you're going to hold something like that, you'd better have a good reason to hold it, right? Because people are going to come against it, namely me. I'm going to argue against you if you think something like that, right? I'm going to argue against you. You think you're not in this room right now? Give me an argument, right? So on the same token, if you're going to hold a minority view, there's nothing wrong with that, so long as you have some sort of argument for it, right? Because your view may be right, even though it's in the minority. Because again, truth is not determined by a majority, right? But if your view is not in the majority, it at least ought to make you stop and think about your view. Does that make sense? What are your thoughts? What are any other objections? Here's an odd thought experiment. Yeah, or against that, any of this stuff. Here's an odd thought experiment I heard one time, unless you were about to offer one. I heard the thought experiment tossed up one time that the paradox of holding that abortion doesn't terminate a human person. One of the paradoxes of that position would be that every woman on the planet could become pregnant, say, carry their child to almost term, and then have an abortion. And there literally be no other people ever born, and the human species completely wiped out, yet no person ever had been killed. Does that make sense? You see, that's the point. They're saying the paradox is, if abortion doesn't terminate a human person, then every woman, say, on Earth, if she were 8 months pregnant, or however, whatever pregnant, terminate the pregnancy and wipe out, and the human species be wiped out, but not one human person was killed. That would be they would say the paradox of that position.
If you were going by this, if you're going by this, then we can just say that, okay, then, it's okay to take away the life of anybody that, like we were talking about, is mentally disabled, right?
Well, if those were your criteria, they would say.
Yeah, or deformed.
But they would say, but the pro-choice side, they would say it's not going to do that. They're not saying that they're evil. They're going to try to go out around and wipe out everybody that's handicapped or whatever.
That's the premise of it.
Right, well, that's what they're saying. They're saying, but logically, that's where your argument would go. They would say. They would say you're being inconsistent with your view, because the views that you're giving to terminate the unborn, the fetus, would also work against those people. But you're not being consistent.
I feel like a lot of them would come back and be like, oh, well, you're going to the slippery slope fallacy.
Right. Well, if there's no connection, is there a slippery slope? If there's no logical connection, is there a slippery slope? Yes. Right. So that's why they want to say that here's their logical connection. Because if you can show that logically there's a connection, then there's not a what? Slippery slope, right? And say, look, here's your logical connection. If this, one of these things, 1, 2, 3, 4, that's your logical connection. You're saying that this is your reasoning. If this is your reasoning, then it also applies here. This isn't a slippery slope. If it applies here, it applies here, because I'm taking your reason and arguing for a different conclusion with your reason.
So then you would actually include, like you're saying, wars and bitches, mentally disabled people.
Depending on what their answer was. Right, depending on what their answer was. It would fall into, they would say, one of those categories. So if it falls into one of those categories, I'll take your category you're using, apply it right here. That's not a slippery slope. That's your reasoning.
That's also under the probably environment and degree of competency. We could say, okay, now every prison.
Well, if they're using that, you'd have to see what they're using. So if they're using some particular premise as a justification. If that premise falls in one of those categories, then they would say you could use that to show that it won't follow.
Every
That doesn't
single
make sense.
time, normally it's in harm of the mother's life and rape. It's always the same point.
Right. But again, even just rhetorically, you could say, all right, well, let's say we concede that. Will you concede that if we make that completely legal, will you be willing to get rid of every other option for that particular position? And then they almost always will say, no. Well, then that's not really you're just hiding behind the hard cases, right? Because if you don't want to get rid of, if we're saying, okay, you can have it there, for sake of argument, concede that, are you willing to get rid of it in any other circumstance? Well, absolutely not. Well, then why are you hiding behind this case? Because this isn't your real issue. I just gave you that one. Does that make sense? The pro-life person would say. They would say, I gave you that one. So why do you still want it over here? Well, that really must not have been your issue then. You were hiding behind that.
That's why it always falls 90% of the time after that point, it falls on the police.
Right. That's what they would say. So don't you guys wish we would have talked about the Socratic method? Don't you wish you would have voted for that instead? Now everybody's gonna walk out like this.
People are gonna argue or something.
But don't you vote for what?
Huh? Huh?
Voted for it.
Don't worry about it.
All right, wait a minute, Karina, look. Either your presentation or Tuesday. Remember, those are Tuesday's the very last day of class. So Thursday or Tuesday, unless you want to take the exam Tuesday. Does everybody else get that? So if you do your presentation Thursday, you don't have to come Tuesday. That makes sense? Does anybody know?
Do we all,